Nice dress.
The emerald silk wrapped around her body like a promise she didn't know she was making. Romy Castellano had one evening off per month, 30 days of scrubbing floors and staying invisible in George Kane's Miami mansion, then 12 hours to remember she was human. Tonight, she'd chosen to feel beautiful. She walked past his study at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps the only moment that ever mattered. The sound came first. Sharp, final, the crack of crystal shattering, not dropped, but crushed from pressure alone. Romy paused in the hallway, emerald silk swishing against her legs, and turned toward the open door. George Kane stood behind his mahogany desk, blood and bourbon pooling where his glass had exploded in his grip. His second in command, Marcus Chun, watched his boss with the careful expression of a man who'd learned when to stay silent. But George wasn't looking at the mess on his desk. He was looking at her. The crime lord who controlled Miami's underworld through calculated violence and colder strategy was staring at his housekeeper like she'd just rewritten every rule he'd ever known. Marcus broke first. "Sir, should I stop her?" But George was already moving. His voice cut through the mansion's expensive silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. The kind of voice that made hardened soldiers flinch and rivals reconsider their choices. "Where exactly do you think you're going dressed like that?" Romy had cleaned his floors for 6 months. She kept her head down, perfected invisibility, survived by staying beneath notice. But tonight, standing in emerald silk and deliberate defiance, she met his eyes directly for the first time. "Out," she said simply. "With friends." The man who'd never lost control of anything suddenly couldn't remember how to breathe. She should have been afraid. George Kane wasn't the kind of man you challenged. Not if you valued breathing, sleeping soundly, or having a future. His empire was built on knowing what people wanted before they did, on 3 steps ahead strategy, on making examples swift and memorable. But Romy wasn't backing down. "I don't belong to anyone," she added, though her voice trembled slightly on the last word. George stared at her. This woman in emerald silk who'd just done what presidents and cartel leaders wouldn't dare. No apology, no fear, just quiet assertion of autonomy in a mansion where he owned everything, including most people's courage. Marcus shifted his weight, hand unconsciously moving toward his concealed weapon. No one spoke to George Kane this way. No one survived it. Instead of consequences, something shifted in George's expression, something that looked almost like respect, or hunger, or both. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Castellano," he said finally, voice carefully neutral. Romy nodded once and walked toward the front entrance, feeling his eyes on her back with every step. The emerald silk suddenly felt less like armor and more like a declaration she hadn't meant to make. She didn't know that George stood in that study for 20 minutes after she left, staring at blood and bourbon on mahogany, realizing he'd just met the only person in Miami who could make him feel powerless. She didn't know he'd follow her. The restaurant was modest, nothing that would attract George Kane's usual attention. But George wasn't there for the food or the clientele. He was there because watching Romy laugh with people who didn't know what monsters looked like made something crack open in his chest that terrified him more than any rival ever had. He sat 3 tables away, deliberately visible, watching, learning. She noticed him 15 minutes in. Their eyes met across the crowded space. Her friends faded to background noise. He didn't approach, didn't need to. He simply watched, letting her feel the weight of his attention, the reality that George Kane had followed his housekeeper to a public restaurant like a man who'd forgotten what dignity looked like. When she finally excused herself and crossed to his table, he saw the calculation in her eyes. Good. She should be calculating. Should be wondering what this meant. "Stalking is illegal," she said quietly, standing beside his table. even for men who think they're above laws. I wanted to see what makes you smile like that. The admission cost him something. She saw it. I've never made anyone smile like that. Romy studied the crime lord sitting alone in a modest restaurant, deliberately making himself vulnerable in public for reasons she suspected even he didn't fully understand. Then maybe you're spending time with the wrong people, she said. She returned to her friends. But she glanced back. He was still watching, still learning what it meant to want something he couldn't take. When Romy returned to the compound at 1 a.m., George was waiting in the garden. Not in his office where power lived, but in moonlight where vulnerability grew. She could have used the staff entrance, could have avoided this conversation. She didn't. I built this empire on knowing what people want before they do, George told her, voice low in the darkness. I can read anyone, predict movements, anticipate needs. He paused. I can't read you. He struggled for the word, terrifying. Romy studied the man who made Miami tremble. Good. Fear keeps people honest. What do you want from me, George? The question hung between them like a confession she was demanding. He could lie, could play games, could revert to the man who controlled everything through strategy and fear. Instead, he gave her something he'd never given anyone, truth without calculation. Everything and nothing. His voice cracked slightly. I want you to stay because you choose it, not because I've left you no choice. I want you to look at me the way you looked at your friends tonight, like I'm worth smiling for. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to want something that way. To want something I can't take or buy or control into existence. The admission hung in the garden air, heavy with the weight of a man discovering he had limits. I'll think about it, Romy said finally. For the first time in his adult life, George Kane waited for someone else's decision. 3 weeks passed. The mansion staff noticed everything changing. George asked rather than commanded. Romy moved from staff quarters to a guest suite. They had dinner together, not in his office with business spread between them, but in the kitchen where equals ate and talked about things that had nothing to do with empires or power. Marcus watched his boss become someone he'd never seen before, someone capable of patience, someone learning that control and connection were different languages entirely. But Miami's underworld noticed too. Sir, we have a problem. Marcus's voice was tight when he entered George's office on day 21. 3 different organizations have noticed your distraction. Word is out that the untouchable George Kane has a weakness now. George's expression went cold. The shift so fast, it was like watching a mask drop back into place. How many know? Too many. That night, security tripled around Romy without explanation. She noticed the shadows multiplying, the new faces watching her, the way George's eyes followed her with something darker than affection now. Calculation mixed with dread. She confronted him in his study at midnight. Why aren't you telling me? His answer was simple and devastating. That making you happy might be what gets you killed. The breach came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Romy woke to her door handle turning slowly, deliberately. The security George posted outside her room was gone. No sound of struggle, no alarm, just absence. She was alone with professional silence moving through her doorway. The intruder got 3 steps in her room before George materialized from the shadows. Not rushing in heroically, but already there. Already waiting. He'd been sitting in the chair by her window for 4 hours, unable to sleep, watching over her because trust was a luxury he couldn't afford when it came to her safety. What happened next wasn't clean or cinematic. It was brutal and final and efficient. George killed the assassin with his bare hands while Romy watched the man she'd been falling for become someone else entirely. Someone capable of ending life without hesitation, without mercy, without any of the gentleness he'd shown her over 3 weeks of kitchen dinners and garden conversations. When it was over, he turned to her with blood on his knuckles and something broken in his eyes. "This is who I am," he said, voice raw. "This is what loving me means. Blood and violence and threats that never stop coming because power doesn't retire gracefully. You want an honesty. This is the honest version." She should have been terrified, should have run, should have seen this moment as the clarifying truth that ended whatever was growing between them. Instead, Romy crossed the room and took his bloodied hands in hers. "Then wash up," she said quietly, "and stay." That night, boundaries dissolved. The housekeeper and the crime lord became something neither of them had words for yet, something built on seeing each other's darkness and choosing not to look away. Romy woke to sunlight and an empty bed. George's side was cold. He'd been gone for hours. No note, no explanation, just his absence and the memory of intimacy that had felt like a promise of permanence. She found Marcus in the hallway, uncomfortable and evasive. "Where is he?" she demanded. Marcus hesitated, then broke under her steady gaze. "He left at 4 a.m. Took 12 men. Said he was cleaning up every loose end that knew your name. Every threat. Every person who might send another assassin through your door." The words hit her like a physical blow. George didn't leave because of regret. He left because loving her made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. Protective instinct turned into systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten what they'd built. But he didn't tell her, didn't think to explain, didn't consider that waking up alone might hurt worse than knowing the violent truth. Romy packed her bag while Marcus watched helplessly. "Tell him," she said, voice carefully controlled, "that if he wants forever, he doesn't get to protect me by disappearing. He doesn't get to make decisions about us alone. And he doesn't get to choose what truths I can handle." She was gone before Marcus could form a response. 3 days felt like 3 years. George tore through his network with singular focus, deploying every resource to find one woman who didn't want to be found. His empire ground to a halt. Business went unattended. Rivals sensed opportunity. Marcus had never seen his boss like this. Unshaven, unfocused, desperate in ways that made him vulnerable. He found her in a Tampa motel on day 3. The man who'd never knelt to anyone, not to rivals, not to allies, not to power itself, felt his knees on cheap carpet that smelled of cleaning solution and broken dreams. "I left to hunt down everyone who knew you existed," George said, voice raw from 3 days without sleep. "I left to make you safe, to eliminate every threat before they could touch you. I should have told you. Should have explained. Should have." She kissed him to stop the words, tasting salt from tears he didn't know he was capable of crying. "Don't protect me from the truth," Romy told him, hands framing his face. "Protect me with it. We're in this together, or we're not in it all. No more decisions made alone. No more treating me like something fragile instead of someone choosing you with full knowledge of what that means." He nodded against her shoulder, learning that vulnerability required more courage than violence ever had. "I'm not leaving that life for you," George said carefully. "I'm leaving it with you, building something different together. There's a difference." "Show me," she replied. They returned to Miami as partners, not crime lord and housekeeper, but two people committed to building something neither had ever trusted before, a future without blood on its foundation. 6 weeks later, George was systematically legitimizing every operation, buying out rivals, converting holdings, transforming blood money into legal enterprises, hotels, real estate, investments that could survive scrutiny. It was costing him power, respect in the underworld, relationships built over decades. He worked 18-hour days, rebuilding himself from the inside out. Romy watched him sacrifice everything he'd built for the possibility of something he'd never had: legitimacy, safety, a life that didn't require looking over his shoulder or sleeping with weapons within reach. At midnight on a Tuesday, she walked into his office where he was buried in acquisition paperwork and said, "If you're really leaving that life, prove it. Marry me. Build something clean with legal vows and public commitment." George stared at her. This woman who kept rewriting every rule about power and partnership. "You're supposed to wait for me to ask," he said, almost laughing. "I'm supposed to be cleaning your floors," she replied. "We've never done supposed to." He pulled a ring from his desk drawer. He'd been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. "There's no perfect moment with us," Romy said, taking the ring and sliding it onto her own finger. "Just real ones." They married 6 weeks later in a private ceremony with only Marcus and Romy's sister Claire as witnesses. The vows were simple. Choose each other every day against impossible odds. Choose truth over comfort. Choose transformation over the easier path of staying who they'd been. The underworld noticed when George Kane became George Kane, CEO, when a crime lord became a businessman, when power built on fear transformed into influence built on legitimate wealth. Not everyone forgave transformation. Some people needed the old George to stay in place, so their own world made sense. Victor Park was one of those people. Romy was 4 months pregnant with her first child when Victor Park made his move. The abduction happened in daylight. Professional, efficient, executed while George was across town at a legitimate business meeting, playing the role of respectable CEO. George received a video 30 minutes later. Romy sat in a warehouse, bound but unbroken, 4 months pregnant, and still radiating the same defiance she'd shown that first night in emerald silk. Victor Park's voice purred through the speakers. "You chose domesticity over dominance, Kane. Now watch what that choice costs. You can have your wife back, or you can keep pretending you're someone different. But you can't have both." The reveal wasn't Romy's fear. It was her fury. Even bound, even pregnant, even facing a man known for brutal solutions to power disputes, she stared into the camera with eyes that could cut glass. "Don't you dare compromise for me," she said, voice steady and clear. "Don't you dare become less to save me. Don't apologize for transformation. Just come get me and show him that being better doesn't mean being weak." George made 3 phone calls. In 72 hours, the Park syndicate ceased to exist. Not negotiated away. Not bought out. Erased. George didn't revert to who he'd been. He became something more dangerous. A man with everything to lose, channeling violence with surgical precision. He systematically dismantled Victor's organization. Cut supply lines. Turned lieutenants. Froze accounts. Made the empire collapse from within while Victor watched everything he'd built crumble in real time. Marcus watched his boss work and realized this wasn't the old George. This was something new. Calculated violence motivated by love rather than empire, protection rather than power, family rather than fear. By the time George arrived at the warehouse, Victor Park was alone. His organization destroyed. His people scattered. His power revealed as the illusion it had always been. "You had a choice," George told him, voice quiet in the empty space. "You could have let me leave. Could have let me build something different. Could have accepted that transformation doesn't weaken anyone. It just changes what they're willing to destroy." Victor laughed, desperate, unhinged. "You think this ends with you? You think you get to just walk away?" George's response was final. "I already did. This isn't about my empire. This is about my family. And you made the mistake of threatening it. One shot. Clean. Final." George carried Romy out himself, Victor's blood still wet on his Italian shoes. In the car, she took his hand. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "Becoming him again?" "I didn't become him," George said carefully. "I became something worse. I became a man who knows exactly how much I'll destroy to keep you safe. That's not the old me. That's the new me. Someone who understands that violence isn't about power anymore. It's about protection, about the line I'll draw and defend for the people who make life worth living. She leaned against his shoulder. Then let's make sure they never have to see that version again. Agreed, he said. This was the last time. It wasn't, but they didn't know that yet. For children in 6 years, Mia, Jackson, Henry, and Samuel. The mansion that had housed crime operations transformed into something softer, toy-scattered, laughter-filled, marked by crayon drawings and school schedules rather than security briefings and territory maps. George Kane became CEO of Kane Enterprises, legitimate businessman, PTA member, father who coached soccer and attended recitals. The transformation seemed complete, past buried deep beneath layers of normalcy. But ghosts don't stay buried when they're blood. George's uncle Dominic had been watching for years, waiting, gathering old loyalists who believed George had gone soft, betrayed what they'd built together, abandoned the empire for domestic weakness. The first sign came when Marcus discovered security footage tampering. Someone inside was feeding information out. George realized the threat wasn't external this time. It was family. The man he displaced to take control 2 decades ago had never stopped wanting it back. I thought we were done with this, Romy said, watching him review security protocols at midnight while their children slept upstairs. We are, George promised. This is the last ghost of who I was. After this, we're just a family. Just people building a legitimate life. But Dominic had already made his move, timed perfectly for the one window when George would be vulnerable. A mandatory business trip to New York that couldn't be canceled without raising questions about his commitment to legitimate operations. George boarded the plane trusting his security, his systems, his transformation, unaware that family betrayal was already inside the walls, waiting for him to be 1,200 miles away. The attack came at 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday. George was in a Manhattan conference room when his phone exploded with alerts. The compound was under siege, not from rivals, but from his own uncle and a team of old loyalists. Traitors among current security had opened the gates from within. George was running for the helicopter before the second alert finished loading. But Romy wasn't waiting to be rescued. 6 years married to George Kane had taught her things. She got all 4 children into the reinforced panic room, the one George had installed just in case, and she'd hoped they'd never need. Then she did something the attackers hadn't planned for. She didn't hide with them. Instead, Romy coordinated the loyal security detail from the command center. The one thing Dominic hadn't accounted for was that George's people weren't just loyal to him anymore. They were loyal to both of them, to the family, to what the Kanes represented now rather than what George had been before. Marcus locked down the panic room and took position outside it while Romy, 6 months pregnant with their 5th child, directed defense like someone who'd learned strategy from the best. She knew the compound better than Dominic did. She'd cleaned these floors before she commanded them, knew every exit, every blind spot, every tactical advantage. George's helicopter landed 23 minutes later to find the attack already contained, traitors subdued, his uncle on his knees in the command center with Romy standing over him. Calm, controlled, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with intelligence applied under pressure. George walked into the command center and stopped. His wife, his pregnant wife, standing over his uncle with all 4 children safe and an attempted coup already neutralized. I had it handled, Romy said simply. I see that, George replied, equal parts pride and terror. The choice before him was simple. Revert to the man who would execute family without hesitation, or prove his transformation was permanent even in the face of betrayal. He stood over Dominic with a gun in his hand and 20 years of muscle memory telling him what came next. Every instinct screamed for the old solution. Final, permanent, unmistakable message. Romy put her hand on his arm, not restraining, just present. "You're not that man anymore," she said quietly. "Don't become him again for me. Not even for this. Not even when it feels justified." George looked at his uncle, then at Marcus, then at the security footage showing his children safe in the panic room. Mia reading to her younger brothers, keeping them calm while violence happened outside their protected space. "You taught me that power is everything," George told Dominic. "But you were wrong. Power is nothing if it costs you the people who make life worth living. Family isn't about blood. It's about who you bleed for. And you just proved you're not family anymore." The sentence wasn't death. It was exile. 24 hours to disappear completely. Every asset frozen. Every connection severed. Every bridge burned. Dominic left with his life and nothing else. After he was gone, George's hand shook. Did I just make a mistake? Show weakness that invites more threats? No, Romy said firmly. You just proved that transformation isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of strength. It's choosing who you want to be even when the easier path is reverting to who you were. They rebuilt. Again, believing the hardest tests were finally behind them. They were wrong. 7 years after the Dominic incident, George Kane had become everything he'd promised. Respected businessman, devoted father to 5 children, philanthropist whose charitable foundation actually helped people rather than laundering money. Their oldest, Mia, was 13. The family had found genuine peace. Then journalist Sarah Brennan started investigating Miami's remarkable urban transformation over the past decade. The unprecedented drop in organized crime, the power vacuum that never filled, the legitimate business boom that seemed to come from nowhere. Her research kept leading back to one name, George Kane. The timeline was too perfect. The park syndicate's collapse, the legitimization wave, the sudden retirement of Miami's most dangerous crime lord coinciding exactly with legitimate business emergence. Sarah approached George directly, journalist ethics intact. I'm writing this story either way. You can let me speculate based on fragments, or you can tell me the truth. Which version do you want your children to read? George brought her to his home, introduced her to Romy, to their 5 children, baby Elena toddling between rooms while her older siblings did homework and argued about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. He gave her 3 days and complete honesty. I was a criminal, he told her on record, voice steady. I hurt people, built power through violence and fear, controlled territory through methods that would justify prosecution if statutes of limitation hadn't expired. Then I met someone who made me want to be worth saving. He glanced at Romy. The question isn't whether I deserve what I have now. The question is whether people can change at all, and whether we let them when they do. Sarah interviewed Marcus, tracked down legitimate business owners who used to run for George's organization, talked to community members who'd been terrified of him once, and now sent their kids to schools his foundation supported. What she found wasn't a simple story of good or evil, but something far more complex about the cost and possibility of transformation. The article published 3 weeks later, The Redemption of George Kane. Can a crime lord become a citizen? It was thorough, honest, pulling no punches about his past while documenting his systematic transformation. The response was immediate and divided. Some demanded prosecution despite expired statutes. Others saw a story of genuine change that proved transformation possible. Opinion editorials argued both sides. Social media exploded, but the surprising response came from their community. The school where Mia attended held a meeting, parents gathering to decide whether the daughter of a former crime lord should be allowed to continue in their children's classrooms. George and Romy sat in the back, prepared for exile. Instead, something unexpected happened. Parents who George had once terrified stood up to speak about the charitable foundation that saved their businesses during the pandemic, the community center he funded, the legitimate jobs his transformation created, the man who showed up to PDA meetings and actually listened instead of commanding. He was a criminal, one father said carefully. He's not anymore. At what point do we let people stop paying for who they were if they've proven who they've become? If we don't allow for transformation, what message does that send our own children about the possibility of change? The vote was closer than it should have been, but Mia stayed in school. The business took hits, contracts canceled by companies unwilling to associate with George's past. But it survived. More importantly, George and Romy set their 5 children down and told them the truth. Age-appropriate versions, but truth nonetheless. Daddy hurt people before you were born, George told them, voice careful. I built power through violence. I was the kind of person people were right to be afraid of. I'm not proud of it. I can't undo it. But I'm spending the rest of my life proving I'm someone different now. Someone worthy of you. Someone who chooses every day to be better than I was. Mia, 13, and processing everything she'd learned, asked, are you still that person inside? Is it just hidden? George considered the question seriously. Parts of him are still in here. The instincts, the skills, the capacity for violence. But they don't control me anymore. The choices do. And I choose differently now. Every single day, I choose differently. Because of Mom? Jackson asked. Because of all of you, George said. Because transformation isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present. It's about building something real with the people who make life worth living. The article's aftermath settled into a new normal. Scrutinized but standing, judged but not destroyed. Some clients returned. Some never would. The family adapted. And as their 10th anniversary approached, George planned something he'd never been good at. Gratitude without control, celebration without fear, love without conditions. George spent weeks planning the vow renewal, not the controlling perfection of his past, where every detail was managed through force and money, but earned perfection. The kind that came from knowing he didn't deserve what he had, but was grateful anyway. He involved all 5 children in planning. Let them choose colors, flowers, music, asked their opinions, and actually listened rather than directing. The night before the ceremony, Mia found him in his study at midnight, practicing vows he'd rewritten 17 times. Dad, are you nervous? Terrified, he admitted. Why? You've been married 10 years. George looked at his daughter, living proof that transformation was possible, that violence didn't have to define futures. That choice mattered more than history. Because I wanted Mom to know that every day I chose her was the day I became who I am. And I want you kids to know that becoming better isn't about erasing who you were. It's about building something new from the honest foundation of truth. It's about proving that change is possible when you have reason enough to try. Mia hugged him. She knows, Dad. We all know. The ceremony day arrived with Florida sunshine and 5 children dressed in their chosen colors. Same private style as their original wedding. Marcus and Claire witnessing, but now with 5 children in the front row representing everything they'd built. When Romy appeared, she was wearing emerald silk, the same shade that started everything a decade ago. Deliberate mirror of that first night. The callback wasn't lost on anyone. George saw the dress and laughed. Genuine, surprised joy breaking through his carefully practiced composure. What do you think you're going dressed like that? He asked, their private joke now family legend. Anywhere I want. Romy replied with the same defiance that had hooked him 10 years ago. Because the man I love taught me that freedom and devotion aren't opposites. That I can be completely myself and completely his. That partnership means two people choosing each other without either losing themselves in the process. George's vows were everything he'd practiced and more. You didn't save me. You showed me I was worth saving. You didn't fix me. You loved me while I fixed myself. Every legitimate business, every clean deal, every morning I wake up and choose to be better. That's not for redemption. Redemption is something others grant. This is for you, for them. He gestured to their children. Because you taught me that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a crime lord's empire. It's what happens when he finds someone worth dismantling it for. When he discovers that power means nothing if you can't share a quiet morning with a person who makes you want to be better than you were yesterday. Romy's vows were simpler, more direct. You became who you needed to be. I just didn't leave while you figured it out. That's not sacrifice. That's partnership. That's what love looks like when it's real. Patient enough to wait for transformation, strong enough to demand honesty, brave enough to stay when staying is harder than leaving. You chose to change. I chose to witness it. We chose each other. Every day, against impossible odds. And I'd make that choice again every single morning for the rest of my life. They exchanged new rings, not replacing the originals, but adding to them. Layers of commitment, like layers of years, that proved love wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about choosing each other again and again until the choosing became who you were. The intimate reception was just family and a handful of people who'd witnessed their journey. Marcus gave a toast about watching George become human. Claire cried happy tears about her sister finding someone who loved her enough to become worthy of that love. The 5 children performed a surprise dance they'd choreographed themselves. Imperfect, enthusiastic, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with joy. During the reception, George's phone rang. Sarah Brennan. A film production company wanted to option the story, the transformation, the redemption, the family built against impossible odds. It was the final public validation he'd never asked for. Proof that his story resonated beyond judgment, that people saw possibility in transformation. George looked at Romy, at their children laughing with Marcus, at the life they'd built from the ruins of who he'd been. Tell them no, he said into the phone. This isn't a story for consumption. It's a life. It's private. It's ours. When he hung up, Romy raised an eyebrow. You just turned down millions and more reputation rehabilitation. I don't need rehabilitation anymore, George said. I need this. Just us. Elena, 6 years old and fearless, tugged his sleeve. Daddy, dance with Mommy. Like in the movies where they're happy. So they did, in their garden, surrounded by family, to music playing from someone's phone. No hired orchestra, no grand ballroom, no performance for cameras or validation from strangers. Just 2 people who found each other in emerald silk and violence and chose, every single day, to become something neither thought possible. Later that night, after children were asleep and guests had departed, George and Romy sat in the same garden where he'd first admitted he couldn't read her. 10 years older, 5 children upstairs, an empire legitimized, a past acknowledged, a future uncertain but theirs. Do you think we made it? Romy asked quietly. Made what? To the other side, to being just people. George considered this, looking at Miami lights in the distance. The city he once controlled through fear, now just a backdrop to a life he controlled through love. I don't think there's another side, he said finally. I think there's just days. And in each one, I choose you and choose to be someone worthy of this family. Some days that's easy. Waking up to your face, hearing our kids laugh, go to work at legitimate business that doesn't require violence. Some days I still feel the old instincts. He touched the scar on his knuckles from that first intruder. But the instincts don't control me anymore. The choices do. And I choose this. Every morning, every decision, Every moment that matters. Romy leaned into him, comfortable silence settling between them like an old friend. Then we've made it far enough, she said. They sat watching the city lights. Two people who'd earned their peace not through perfection, but through persistence. Not through avoiding darkness, but through choosing light when it mattered most. The emerald dress hung in their closet upstairs, preserved carefully. Not a costume, not armor, just silk that happened to be the right color on the right night, when two people collided and created something neither knew how to build, but both refused to abandon. That's not redemption. That's not even transformation in the fairy tale sense. That's just what happens when you find someone worth changing for, and discover along the way that you're worth it too. Morning sunlight woke George early. Old habits from dangerous times never fully left. He still woke at 5:47 a.m. regardless of whether threats existed. But now, instead of checking security for enemies, he checked security cameras to see which child woke up first. This morning it was Mia, already in the kitchen making coffee. When did she get old enough for coffee? She saw him on the camera and waved, gestured him downstairs. In the kitchen, father and daughter shared quiet morning space, the kind of peace that felt earned rather than given. I Googled you last night, Mia said. Not looking up from the coffee, she was preparing exactly how he took it. When had she learned that? George's breath caught. This was the moment he dreaded for 13 years. His children discovering the unfiltered truth beyond family conversations. And I'm glad I know the whole truth. I'm glad you told us before the internet did. I'm glad you trusted us enough to be honest. She handed him coffee and met his eyes. So much of Romy in her expression, but something of him too in the directness. You know what's weird, Dad? All my friends' parents tell them they're perfect. They've never made mistakes. Everything's always been easy. But you and Mom are honest. You tell us you messed up. You tell us about choosing to change. You tell us that becoming better is work that never stops. She paused. I don't know. That's better than perfect. That's real. That's why I believe you when you say we can.